I'll never forget the way she looked at me when I handed her that quilt. Like I'd just pulled a dirty dish rag out of the trash and expected her to wear it as a scarf. Her lips curled into this perfect sneer, the kind only someone raised on designer handbags and imported silk could pull off. "Oh, Aunt Medea," she drawled, rolling my name like it was something bitter stuck to the roof of her mouth. "How quaint. But honestly, this is so cheap." That word, cheap, hit me harder than any slap ever could. Cheap. As if the hours my sister, Calliope, poured into stitching every square didn't matter. As if the memories stitched into those faded fabrics were worthless scraps meant for the bin. I watched Miriam toss the quilt onto the pile of garbage bags outside like it was yesterday's newspaper. And you know what hurt the most? She didn't even blink. Not once. You see, I'm not one to hold grudges lightly. At 67, I've lived long enough to know that life is too short to waste on petty squabbles. But this wasn't petty. It felt personal, like she'd taken a match to the last piece of my sister I had left. So while everyone else sipped their wine and nibbled on hors d'oeuvres in my cozy little cottage by the sea, I stood there, staring at the fire crackling in my hearth, and let the first ember of revenge flicker to life inside me. Miriam Caldwell thought she was better than me, that much was clear. To her, I was just some kooky old woman who hoarded junk no one wanted anymore. But oh, how wrong she was. What she didn't realize, and what I planned to teach her slowly, painfully, was that sometimes, the things we dismiss as worthless hold more power than we can ever imagine. By the time I was done with her, she'd learn exactly why calling my gift Trashy was the biggest mistake she'd ever made. It started with the house, or rather her plan to sell it. You'd think after all these years, Miriam would have learned to consult me before making decisions about family property. But no, there she was, scrolling through her phone during brunch, showing off glossy renderings of some sleek modern monstrosity she intended to build where Calliope's home once stood. "It's progress, Aunt Medea," she said, flashing me that insincere smile of hers. "Time to move forward." Move forward? My blood boiled. Did she really think bulldozing our history counted as progress? So when she announced she'd be clearing out the house next weekend, I volunteered to help. Naturally, she hesitated. I could tell she didn't trust me. But eventually she agreed, probably assuming I'd just slow her down. Little did she know I had other plans. That house was a treasure trove of memories, each room brimming with relics of our past. And I wasn't about to let her throw them away without a fight. The attic smelled like dust and nostalgia, which suited me just fine. While Miriam flitted around downstairs, snapping photos for her real estate agent, I rummaged through boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. A shoebox filled with letters tied together with a fraying ribbon. They were written by Calliope, chronicling her painstaking efforts to create the quilt now rotting in a dumpster somewhere. One letter, dated months before she passed, brought tears to my eyes. "I hope Miriam will appreciate this someday, even if she doesn't understand it now." Clutching the letters, I descended the creaky stairs, my mind racing. If Miriam couldn't see the value in the quilt, perhaps these words could open her eyes. But as I entered the living room, I found her tossing an antique mirror into a cardboard box marked "Donate." Without hesitation, I slipped the letters into my coat pocket. Some lessons I decided couldn't be taught, they had to be earned. Over the next few weeks, I became something of a collector again, though not in the way people expected. Every item Miriam dismissed as junk, every chair, vase, or picture frame, I quietly bought back from her estate sale. It wasn't hard. She was so eager to unload everything that she practically gave them away. Each piece found a new home in my cottage, displayed proudly alongside labels detailing its history. The chipped porcelain doll? A gift from Calliope's childhood sweetheart. The tarnished silver tray? Used at every family Thanksgiving for decades. Together they formed a museum of sorts, a testament to the stories Miriam refused to acknowledge. When she finally caught wind of what I was doing, her reaction was predictably dramatic. "Are you trying to embarrass me?" she demanded during one of her rare visits. Her voice dripped with indignation, but beneath it I detected a hint of unease. "Good. Let her squirm." "Oh, Miriam," I replied, sipping my tea with deliberate calm. "Embarrassment is the least of your worries." Her accusations came fast and furious after that. First, it was whispers among the townsfolk. Rumors that I was losing my mind, hoarding junk like some deranged magpie. Then it escalated to outright confrontation. You're deliberately sabotaging me, she spat one evening, storming into my kitchen uninvited. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling as she waved a crumpled flyer advertising my museum. Do you have any idea how ridiculous this looks? People are laughing at me. I set down my knitting needles and met her gaze steadily. Maybe they should laugh, I said softly. Maybe they should laugh at how quickly you threw away your own heritage for a quick buck. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a crack in the polished facade she worked so hard to maintain. But then she shook her head, muttered something about needing air and stormed out. As the door slammed behind her, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The game was far from over. Miriam wasn't the type to let things go quietly, and I should have known she'd retaliate. But even I underestimated just how far she'd stoop. It started with whispers. Tiny little barbs whispered behind cupped hands at the farmer's market or over coffee at the diner. Poor Medea, they'd say, shaking their heads. She's been acting so strange lately. Then came the outright lies. Claims that I was hoarding trash, refusing to pay my taxes, or worse, losing my grip on reality altogether. At first I laughed it off. Let them talk, I thought. Their opinions wouldn't change the truth. But then the rumors reached my friends, people who had known me for decades, and that's when it stung. Old Mrs. Hargrove stopped by one afternoon, her face pinched with concern. Medea dear, she began hesitantly, are you sure you're all right? Miriam mentioned you've been struggling. Struggling? Oh, I was struggling all right, but not in the way they thought. If Miriam wanted to play dirty, I could play dirtier. After all, I'd spent years building connections in the antiques world. Dealers, collectors, historians, all of whom owed me favors. So I put those relationships to good use. First, I anonymously tipped off several of Miriam's high-profile clients about discrepancies in her inventory. A few strategically placed calls later, and suddenly accusations of counterfeit furnishings began swirling around her business. Then I turned my attention to her personal life. Through a mutual acquaintance, I arranged for a series of minor but infuriating mishaps. Cancelled reservations, lost packages, missed deadlines. Nothing too drastic, just enough to keep her perpetually frazzled. And the best part? She couldn't trace any of it back to me. Every time she tried to confront me, I'd simply smile sweetly and say, "Oh Miriam, if only you weren't so quick to blame others." The real coup de grace came during the annual Harvest Festival, an event that brought the entire town together. Miriam, desperate to repair her image, had volunteered to organize the silent auction. A perfect opportunity for her to showcase her design skills and ingratiate herself with the community. But unbeknownst to her, I'd already planted seeds of doubt among the attendees. As she stood at the podium, gushing about the exquisite craftsmanship of the donated items, I raised my hand casually. "Actually, Miriam," I interjected loud enough for everyone to hear, "I believe some of these pieces might be reproductions rather than originals." Gasps rippled through the crowd as people exchanged skeptical glances. Miriam's face turned crimson as she sputtered, "That's absurd. Who told you that?" I merely smiled, leaning back in my chair. "Sometimes," I said coolly, "cheap imitations look convincing until you know better." By winter, Miriam was unraveling faster than a cheap sweater in a thorn bush. Her once thriving business was hemorrhaging clients, her social circle had shrunk to practically nothing, and her attempts to discredit me had backfired spectacularly. Desperate, she resorted to her most audacious move yet, forging a document claiming ownership of my cottage. She showed up unannounced one frosty morning, lawyer in tow, waving the paper like it was a royal decree. "This is my property now," she declared, her voice trembling with triumph. I didn't flinch. Instead, I calmly pulled out a folder containing irrefutable proof that I'd transferred the deed into a trust months ago, legally untouchable by anyone including her. Her smug expression faltered, then crumbled entirely. "You can't do this," she shrieked, tears welling in her eyes. "Everything I've worked for, it's falling apart." "Oh Miriam," I said softly, closing the folder. "Perhaps you should have thought twice before burning bridges." A month passed before we crossed paths again. By then the snow had melted, leaving puddles of icy water along the cobblestone streets. Miriam arrived at my door uninvited, clutching a soggy umbrella and looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen her. Gone was the polished designer. In her place stood a woman teetering on the edge of ruin. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I considered turning her away, but something in her defeated posture made me relent. "Tea," I offered, gesturing toward the kitchen table. As she sat down, shivering despite the warmth of the room, I slid a photo album across the table. Inside were images of the heirlooms she'd discarded, each accompanied by notes detailing their provenance and value. "These worthless items," I explained, "were auctioned off anonymously. The proceeds went to charity in your name." Her jaw dropped, horror dawning in her eyes. "Why would you?" she started, but I cut her off. "Because sometimes cheap things hold the most value." The next week, Miriam appeared at my doorstep again, this time bearing boxes filled with trinkets and furniture she'd salvaged from her mother's house. "Here," she said, thrusting them toward me. "Take them back. I don't want them anymore." Her tone was clipped, almost robotic, as if she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. I didn't touch the boxes. Instead, I folded my arms and studied her carefully. "And what exactly do you think returning these will accomplish?" I asked. She hesitated, clearly unprepared for my question. "I'm trying to make amends," she muttered, avoiding my gaze. "Isn't that what you wanted?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Miriam. What I wanted was for you to understand why these things mattered in the first place. But you can't unburn bridges, can you?" Winter gave way to spring, and with it came one of those fierce coastal storms that always seemed to rattle my cottage windows. Lightning split the sky like jagged veins and the wind howled like a banshee. I was tucked safely inside, knitting by candlelight, when there was a frantic knock at the door. It was Miriam, drenched and shivering, her designer coat soaked through. "The roof, it's caving in," she gasped, clutching the doorframe for support. Her mother's old house, which she'd been using as temporary shelter, had fallen victim to years of neglect. The storm had exposed cracks in the foundation and weakened beams, leaving her stranded without power or heat. Reluctantly, I let her stay the night, not out of kindness but because even I couldn't leave someone to freeze. As we huddled together in the dim light, listening to the storm rage outside, an uneasy truce settled between us. For the first time in months, the animosity felt less like a wall and more like a fragile bridge, one neither of us dared to cross yet. In the days following the storm, something shifted in Miriam. She began showing up at my cottage unannounced, not to argue or plead but to help. At first it was small gestures, bringing groceries, chopping firewood, but soon she started taking on bigger tasks. She patched leaks in the roof, repaired broken furniture, and even helped me organize the cluttered attic. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments when her frustration bubbled over. "Why do you keep all this junk?" But she persisted nonetheless. I watched her closely during these quiet afternoons, trying to reconcile this version of Miriam with the woman who'd once dismissed her family's history as worthless. Was she truly changing, or was this just another act? One evening, as we sat side by side on the porch watching the sunset, she finally spoke. "I didn't understand," she admitted softly. "Not just about the quilt, but everything. Mom's letters, the heirlooms, the stories, they meant something to you. To all of us." Her voice cracked, and for the first time I saw genuine regret in her eyes. As much as I wanted to believe her, to forgive her, I couldn't shake the feeling that some wounds ran too deep to heal. Revenge had consumed me for so long that letting go felt like losing a part of myself. Still, I allowed her to stay, partly out of pity and partly because her presence filled the silence I'd grown accustomed to. But every time she smiled or thanked me, guilt gnawed at the edges of my satisfaction. Had I gone too far? One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old photographs, I found a picture of Calliope and me as children, standing proudly beside the very quilt Miriam had discarded. Tears welled in my eyes as I traced the edges of the faded image. How could I have forgotten what it felt like to love someone so fiercely? When Miriam walked into the room moments later, I quickly tucked the photo away, unwilling to share the vulnerability it stirred within me. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing my expression. "Nothing," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just memories." By December, the air was crisp with the scent of pine and wood smoke. Despite our tentative reconciliation, tension lingered between us like frost on a window pane. On Christmas Eve, Miriam handed me an envelope. A letter, she explained, written in a moment of anger after the Harvest Festival debacle. I never sent it, she confessed, her cheeks flushing. But I think you should read it now. Inside was a torrent of accusations, each line dripping with venom. She accused me of ruining her life, of manipulating people against her, of being as selfish and vindictive as she'd ever been. My hands trembled as I read, anger bubbling beneath the surface. By the time I reached the final sentence, "You'll never be happy until you destroy me," I couldn't bear to look at her. Without a word, I tossed the letter into the fireplace, watching the flames consume it. "You're right," I said quietly. "I won't be happy. Neither will you." Spring arrived with a vengeance, painting the world in vibrant greens and blues. Miriam remained in town, though she no longer lived in her mother's crumbling house. Instead, she rented a modest apartment above the bakery and threw herself into odd jobs around the community. Rumors swirled about her newfound humility, how she spent weekends volunteering at the shelter, teaching carpentry classes to local kids, and restoring pieces of furniture she once deemed worthless. Some whispered she was trying to rebuild her reputation. Others believed she might actually be changing. I kept my distance, observing from afar. Part of me wanted to trust her transformation, but the scars of betrayal ran too deep. Every time I saw her working tirelessly on a project or laughing with townsfolk, I wondered if she was doing it for redemption, or for show. Yet there was no denying the sincerity in her actions. She seemed lighter somehow, as if shedding the weight of her past mistakes had freed her in ways neither of us expected. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself walking along the beach, a rare indulgence since I preferred the comfort of my cottage. To my surprise, Miriam was already there, barefoot and staring out at the waves. For a moment we stood in silence, the sound of crashing water filling the space between us. Then she spoke. "Do you ever wonder if we could have done things differently?" Her question caught me off guard. "Differently how?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She sighed, running a hand through her wind-tousled hair. "If I hadn't thrown away the quilt, if I'd listened to your stories instead of dismissing them, maybe none of this would have happened." Her voice broke and she turned away, ashamed. "I'm sorry, Aunt Medea. Truly." Her apology hung in the air like the salty mist rising from the ocean. I wanted to believe her, to let those two simple words, "I'm sorry," wash away the bitterness that had festered between us for so long. But apologies, no matter how heartfelt, couldn't undo the damage already done. Still, I nodded silently, unable to meet her gaze. "Sometimes," I said finally, my voice barely audible over the waves, "sorry isn't enough." She flinched at my words but didn't argue. Instead, she picked up a smooth stone from the sand and hurled it into the water, watching as ripples spread outward. "I know," she admitted softly. "But I have to try. For Mom's sake. For ours." Her honesty caught me off guard. For years I'd convinced myself that Miriam was incapable of genuine remorse. Yet here she was, standing on the edge of redemption, hoping against hope that I'd extend a hand. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation on the beach. Was it possible to forgive someone who had hurt you so deeply? Could trust ever be rebuilt once it was shattered? These questions swirled in my mind like storm clouds, refusing to settle. By morning I still didn't have answers, but I knew one thing. Holding on to anger wasn't making me happy. When Miriam knocked on my door later that day, carrying a toolbox and a determined expression, I didn't turn her away. Together we tackled repairs around the cottage, patching walls, painting shutters, and scrubbing floors until the place gleamed like new. There were moments of tension, of course, when old wounds threatened to reopen. But there were also flashes of laughter, of shared memories sparked by forgotten objects tucked away in dusty corners. Slowly, tentatively, a fragile peace began to take root. As summer approached, Miriam surprised me with an idea that left me speechless. "Why don't we turn the house into a museum?" she suggested one afternoon, her eyes alight with excitement. "Not just any museum. A tribute to Mom, to Calliope, to everything they stood for. We could display the heirlooms, tell their stories." Her voice trailed off, unsure of how I'd react. For a moment I simply stared at her, stunned. It was as if she'd reached into my heart and pulled out a dream I hadn't dared to voice aloud. "You'd do that?" I asked cautiously. She nodded earnestly. It's what she would have wanted. What we should have done all along. And though I couldn't bring myself to fully trust her intentions, I agreed. After all, Preserving our family's legacy was worth more than any lingering grudge. By autumn, the museum was nearly complete. Rooms brimmed with treasures once dismissed as junk, each piece accompanied by plaques detailing its history and significance. Visitors marveled at the craftsmanship, lingered over photographs, and listened intently as Miriam recounted tales of Calliope's life. Watching her speak so passionately, I felt a pang of pride mixed with sorrow. Pride because she'd finally embraced her roots. Sorrow because it had taken losing everything for her to see their value. Then came the day I fell ill. It started with fatigue, then progressed to weakness that no amount of rest could cure. Miriam noticed immediately, insisting I see a doctor. When the diagnosis came, terminal illness, I wasn't surprised. At 70 I'd lived a full life. What surprised me was Miriam's reaction. She refused to leave my side, caring for me with a tenderness I hadn't thought her capable of. One evening, as I lay in bed surrounded by quilts, including the one she'd discarded, she handed me a journal. "For you," she whispered. Inside were stories about each heirloom, written in her own hand. On the final page she'd scrawled a note: "Value isn't always measured in dollars. Sometimes it's found in the threads that bind us." My remaining days passed in a blur of warmth and quiet reflection. Miriam stayed by my side, reading to me, sharing memories, and ensuring I was comfortable. Though pain lingered in my body, my heart felt lighter than it had in years. Finally, on a crisp October morning, I slipped away peacefully, clutching the restored quilt in my arms. Miriam honored my wishes, burying me beside Calliope beneath a tree whose leaves burned fiery orange in the autumn sun. In my will, I left her the cottage and the museum, along with a letter urging her to continue preserving our family's legacy. "The past is a gift," I wrote. "Don't let it gather dust." Years later, Miriam stands on the beach where we once walked together, the quilt draped over her shoulders like a shield against the biting wind. She's become a curator now, dedicating her life to telling stories through artifacts others might overlook. Yet, despite her success, she carries the weight of knowing she never fully earned my forgiveness. As waves crash behind her, she clutches the quilt tighter, tracing its faded patterns with trembling fingers. Somewhere deep inside she feels me, the echo of my voice, the warmth of my presence. And though the ache of regret remains, she finds solace in the knowledge that some lessons, however painful, leave lasting imprints. Like threads in a quilt, they weave us together, binding us across time and memory.